The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle, as 8-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the garden paths. Unlike other children his age who might run and play loudly, George had learned early that his life was different. Every step he took was watched, every word he spoke was remembered, and every action he made could become tomorrow's headline. James Mitchell had been standing guard at the castle's east entrance for nearly 15 years. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine and his posture straight as an arrow. At 42 years old, James took pride in his duty to protect the royal family. He had seen princes and princesses grow up, witnessed historic moments, and stood silent through countless royal events. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. James took his position at exactly 6 in the morning, relief taking over from the night guard with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The early autumn air was crisp and a light mist hung over the castle grounds. James had been feeling unwell for the past few days, but royal guards never showed weakness. His throat was sore, his head pounded with a dull ache, and he felt dizzy at times, but duty came first. Prince George noticed James immediately as he passed by on his morning walk with his nanny. The young prince had always been observant, watching the people around him with curious eyes. He saw how the guards stood for hours without moving, how they never complained about the weather, and how they always smiled politely when the royal family passed by. On this morning, something was different about James. The guard's usual perfect posture seemed forced, and there were small beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. George slowed his pace, pretending to examine some flowers in the nearby garden bed while stealing glances at the guard. James felt Prince George's eyes on him, but maintained his professional composure. However, a sudden wave of dizziness hit him and he had to fight hard not to sway. His vision blurred for a moment and he blinked rapidly, hoping no one would notice. The last thing he wanted was to appear weak in front of the royal family. The young prince watched as James discreetly wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. George had seen his own father do the same thing when he was feeling sick, but trying to hide it during important meetings. Something stirred in the 8-year-old's heart, a feeling he couldn't quite name but knew was important. As George continued his walk, he couldn't stop thinking about James. He had learned about duty and service from his parents, but seeing it up close was different. Here was a man who was clearly unwell but still stood at his post, protecting George's family without complaint. The prince felt a deep respect for this dedication, but also a growing concern. Throughout the morning, George found excuses to walk past James's post. Each time he noticed the guard looking paler and more strained. By midday, James was gripping his ceremonial weapon a little tighter, using it to steady himself when he thought no one was looking. Prince George had been taught many lessons about leadership, kindness, and responsibility. His parents always emphasized that with privilege came the duty to care for others. As he watched James struggle through his shift, the young prince began to form a plan. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew he had to do something. The afternoon sun climbed higher and James's condition worsened. He felt feverish and weak, but there were still several hours left in his shift. Changing guard positions wasn't something done lightly, and James couldn't bear the thought of letting down his fellow guards or appearing unable to fulfill his duties. Prince George spent the rest of the day thinking about James, about duty, about kindness, and about what it truly meant to be royal. His young mind was working through ideas that would soon lead to an action that would surprise everyone at the castle and touch the heart of a dedicated guard who had given so much in service to the crown. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that threatened rain. James Mitchell woke up feeling even worse than the day before. His fever had climbed during the night and every muscle in his body ached. He looked at himself in the small mirror of his quarters and saw a pale, tired face staring back. Any reasonable person would call in sick, but James had never missed a day of duty in his 15 years of service. He dressed slowly in his guard uniform, each movement requiring more effort than usual. His hands shook slightly as he fastened the brass buttons and adjusted his ceremonial hat. The thought of standing for another 8-hour shift felt overwhelming, but James had a deep sense of honor that wouldn't let him abandon his post. Meanwhile, Prince George had barely slept. He kept thinking about James and how sick the guard had looked yesterday. The 8-year-old had asked his nanny about the guard's schedules, and learned that they worked long shifts, often standing in the same spot for hours without breaks. This information only deepened George's concern for James. At breakfast with his parents, Prince George was unusually quiet. Prince William noticed his son's thoughtful mood and asked if everything was all right. George simply nodded and continued eating his cereal. But his mind was racing with ideas about how he could help James without causing trouble or embarrassing the guard. James took his position at the east entrance at 6 in the morning as always. The threatening clouds above seemed to match how he felt inside. Within the first hour, he had to steady himself against the wall twice, hoping no one would notice. His throat was so sore that swallowing was painful, and his fever made everything feel distant and unreal. Prince George appeared for his morning walk earlier than usual. He deliberately chose a path that would take him past James's post multiple times. What he saw worried him even more than yesterday. James was noticeably swaying, and his usually perfect uniform looked disheveled. The guard's face was flushed with fever. Yet he remained at his post with unwavering determination. The young prince stopped near a bench about 20 feet from James and pretended to read a book his nanny had brought. In reality, he was watching the guard carefully, seeing how James would grip his weapon tighter whenever he felt unsteady, how he would blink hard to clear his vision, and how he would take deep breaths as if fighting off waves of nausea. Around 10 in the morning, it started to drizzle. The light rain made James's condition even more challenging. His fever made him feel alternately hot and cold, and the dampness seemed to seep into his bones. Still, he stood firm, water droplets collecting on his uniform and hat. Prince George watched from a covered walkway as the rain began to fall harder. He saw James getting soaked but maintaining his position without complaint. The sight of this dedicated man suffering in silence while protecting his family moved something deep in the young prince's heart. That's when George made his decision. He had been taught that true nobility came from serving others, not from being served. He had learned that real strength meant caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. And he understood that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was a simple act of kindness. The prince quietly slipped away from his nanny's supervision and headed toward the castle kitchens. He had a plan forming in his mind, something small but meaningful that might help James get through his difficult shift. George knew he might get in trouble for what he was about to do, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. In the kitchen, George approached Mrs. Chen, the head cook who had always been kind to him. He explained that he wanted to prepare something special for one of the guards who wasn't feeling well. Mrs. Chen was surprised by the request, but was touched by the young prince's thoughtfulness. Together, they prepared a thermos of hot tea with honey and lemon, perfect for a sore throat. They also packed some simple crackers and soup in a container that could be easily eaten during a brief break. George carefully carried these items, his small hands gripping the warm thermos tightly. As he walked back toward James's post, Prince George felt nervous but determined. He had never done anything like this before, and he wasn't sure how James would react. But he knew that his parents had always taught him to treat others with kindness and respect, regardless of their position in life. The rain continued to fall as George approached the east entrance where James stood, still as a statue despite his obvious illness. The young prince took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to do something that would surprise everyone and show the true character that lived in his 8-year-old heart. Prince George walked slowly toward James, the warm thermos clutched in his small hands and a container of soup tucked under his arm. The rain was falling steadily now, and he could see that James was completely soaked but still standing perfectly straight at his post. The guard's dedication was remarkable, but George could also see the toll it was taking on the sick man. As George approached, James noticed the young prince coming toward him. Despite feeling terrible, James straightened even more and prepared to give his usual respectful greeting. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he was determined to maintain his professional composure no matter how awful he felt. George stopped directly in front of James and looked up at the tall guard with serious, caring eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to fall around them, and the only sound was the soft patter of droplets on the stone walkway. "Mr. James," Prince George said quietly, his young voice carrying a maturity that surprised the guard. "I brought you something because I can see that you're not feeling well, but you're still here protecting my family." James was stunned. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever approached him like this. He started to speak, to politely decline whatever the prince was offering, but George gently interrupted him. "Please," the 8-year-old said, holding up the thermos. "It's hot tea with honey and lemon. My grandmother always gives this to me when my throat hurts. And there's some soup too, in case you get a chance to eat something." The guard felt his eyes begin to water, and it wasn't from the rain or his fever. He was overwhelmed by the kindness of this small boy who had noticed his suffering and cared enough to do something about it. James had spent years protecting the royal family, but he had never imagined that one of them would try to take care of him. "Your Highness," James managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion and illness. "This is incredibly kind, but I'm on duty. I cannot accept." George stepped closer and gently placed the thermos on a small ledge beside James's post. "I'm not asking you to break any rules, Mr. James. I'm just leaving this here in case you need it. My father always says that taking care of ourselves helps us take care of others better." The simplicity and wisdom of the child's words hit James like a wave. Here was an 8-year-old boy who understood something about leadership and compassion that many adults never learned. George wasn't trying to get James in trouble or make him abandon his duties. He was simply offering comfort to someone who was suffering. "I've been watching you," George continued, his small face serious and concerned. "You've been sick for 2 days, but you keep standing here to protect us. That means a lot to my family. It means a lot to me." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. The fever had been making him feel isolated and miserable, but suddenly he didn't feel alone anymore. This little prince had seen his struggle and had responded with pure kindness. George reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "I also wrote you a note," he said, placing it carefully next to the thermos. "You don't have to read it now, but maybe later when you have a quiet moment." The note was written in careful, childish handwriting. "Dear Mr. James, thank you for keeping my family safe even when you don't feel good. You are very brave and kind. I hope the tea helps your throat feel better. Your friend, Prince George." James looked down at the note, and despite all his training in maintaining composure, a single tear rolled down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, but George had seen it and understood that sometimes even the strongest people needed to know that someone cared about them. "I should go back now," George said softly, "but please drink the tea when you can. And if you need to sit down or take a break, I won't tell anyone. Sometimes being strong means knowing when to rest." With that, the young prince turned and walked away, leaving James standing there with a warm thermos, a container of soup, a heartfelt note, and a heart that felt lighter than it had in days. The rain continued to fall, but somehow James felt warmer and stronger than he had since his illness began. As George disappeared around the corner, James looked down at the simple gifts that represented so much more than food and drink. They represented recognition, compassion, and the kind of leadership that inspired loyalty, not through power or position, but through genuine care for others. For the first time in 15 years of service, James felt that he wasn't just protecting the royal family. He was part of something bigger, something that included mutual respect and human kindness. The 8-year-old prince had given him more than tea and soup. He had given him dignity and hope. James stood at his post for another hour after Prince George left, but everything felt different now. The thermos sat nearby, steam occasionally rising from its lid, and the folded note remained safe in his pocket. Every few minutes he would glance at these simple gifts and feel a warmth that had nothing to do with the fever coursing through his body. When his supervisor, Captain Morrison, made his routine check around noon, James was prepared to explain the situation. He had never been in a position like this before, and wasn't sure what protocol demanded when a member of the royal family had personally brought him refreshments. "Mitchell," Captain Morrison said as he approached, his trained eye immediately noticing the thermos and container. "What's this?" James straightened, even though the movement made his head spin. "Sir, Prince George brought me tea and soup because he noticed I was unwell. I informed him I was on duty, but he insisted on leaving the items here." Captain Morrison looked surprised. In his 25 years overseeing the royal guards, he had never encountered such a situation. He examined James more closely and could see the obvious signs of illness that the dedicated guard had been trying to hide. "Mitchell, you look terrible. Why didn't you report sick this morning?" "Sir, I didn't want to leave my post unmanned or burden the other guards with additional duties," James replied honestly. Captain Morrison felt a mix of frustration and admiration. James's dedication was exactly what made him an excellent guard. But it was also potentially dangerous to have a sick person on duty. However, the fact that 8-year-old Prince George had noticed and cared enough to help put the situation in a new light. "The prince noticed you were ill before I did," Captain Morrison said thoughtfully. "That says something about both his awareness and your determination to hide your condition." Meanwhile, Prince George had returned to his regular activities, but his mind kept wandering back to James. During his afternoon lessons, his tutor noticed that the young prince seemed distracted and kept looking toward the windows that faced the east entrance. "Prince George, is everything all right?" his tutor asked. George hesitated for a moment, then decided to be honest. "There's a guard who's been sick, and I gave him some tea and soup. I keep wondering if he's feeling better." His tutor was touched by the prince's compassion, but also impressed by his practical approach to helping someone in need. This wasn't just childish sympathy. It was thoughtful action based on careful observation. Back at his post, James finally allowed himself a small sip of the tea during a brief moment when no one was watching. The warm liquid with honey and lemon soothed his aching throat immediately, and he felt a surge of gratitude toward the young prince, who had thought to provide exactly what he needed. The afternoon brought more visitors to the castle, including several dignitaries who needed to pass by James's post. Despite his illness, James maintained his professional demeanor, but the tea had given him enough relief to make his duties more bearable. Around 4 o'clock, Prince William was walking through the castle grounds when he noticed the thermos and container near the east entrance. Curious, he approached James to inquire about the unusual items. "Good afternoon, James. I couldn't help but notice these items. Is everything all right?" James felt his heart race. He had hoped to get through his shift without drawing attention to Prince George's kind gesture, but now he had to explain the situation to the prince's father. "Your Highness, Prince George brought me tea and soup because he observed that I was feeling unwell. I want to assure you that I maintained my duties throughout and did not abandon my post." Prince William looked at James with new eyes. He could see the obvious signs of illness that his 8-year-old son had noticed before any of the adults. He felt a surge of pride in George's compassion and wisdom, but also concern for the guard's well-being. "James, how long have you been ill?" "2 days, sir, but I didn't want to miss my duties." Prince William nodded, understanding. He had been raised with the same sense of duty and knew how difficult it was to balance personal needs with responsibilities. However, he also recognized that George had demonstrated remarkable leadership in this situation. "My son showed excellent judgment," Prince William said quietly, "both in recognizing your dedication and in finding a way to help without compromising your duties." "I hope the tea is helping." James felt another wave of emotion. Not only had Prince George shown him kindness, but now his father was acknowledging and approving of that kindness. The royal family's genuine care for their staff was becoming very real to him in a way it had never been before. "It has helped tremendously, Your Highness. Prince George's thoughtfulness means more than I can express." Prince William smiled and patted James gently on the shoulder. Sometimes the smallest gestures have the biggest impact. George has learned that lesson well. As Prince William walked away, James felt something shifting inside him. His fever was still present, his body still ached, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. The simple act of kindness from an 8-year-old had opened his eyes to the true character of the family he had spent 15 years protecting. That evening, after James had finally completed his shift and returned to his quarters, he sat on his small bed and carefully unfolded Prince George's note for the 10th time. Each reading brought fresh emotion, and he found himself memorizing every carefully written word. The simple message from an 8-year-old had touched something deep in his soul that years of formal recognition and commendations had never reached. James had joined the Royal Guard 15 years ago with dreams of honor and service, but over time, the work had become routine. Day after day of standing, watching, and protecting had made him feel somewhat invisible and disconnected from the people he served. Prince George's gesture had reminded him that his service mattered on a human level, not just a professional one. Meanwhile, Prince George was having dinner with his family. He had been quieter than usual throughout the meal, and his parents could tell something was on his mind. Finally, Prince William decided to address what had happened that day. "George, I heard about what you did for James today. I'm very proud of you for noticing that he needed help and finding a thoughtful way to provide it." George looked up from his food, his young face serious. He was really sick, Dad, but he kept standing there in the rain to protect us. I thought about how awful I feel when I'm sick, and I couldn't just walk by and pretend I didn't see it. Kate, Prince George's mother, felt her heart swell with pride. That shows real maturity and compassion, sweetheart. How did you know what to bring him? When I get sick, Grandma always makes me tea with honey, and Mrs. Chen helped me make some for him. I thought maybe it would help his throat feel better. The simplicity of his reasoning impressed both parents. George hadn't overthought the situation or worried about protocol. He had simply seen someone suffering and responded with kindness, the way he had been taught to treat all people. What made you notice that James was sick when the adults around him didn't? Prince William asked, genuinely curious about his son's observation skills. George thought for a moment. I watch people a lot. I see how they usually act, and when something's different, I notice. James usually stands really straight and never moves, but today he was swaying a little and wiping his face. Plus, he looked really pale. This level of awareness in such a young child amazed his parents. George was naturally developing the kind of observational skills and empathy that would serve him well in his future role. But more importantly, he was learning to use those skills to help others. The next morning, James woke up feeling significantly better. His fever had broken during the night, and while he was still tired, the worst of his illness had passed. He prepared for his shift with more energy than he had felt in days, and he found himself looking forward to seeing Prince George again. When James took his position at the east entrance, he noticed that the thermos and container had been quietly removed overnight. Everything was back to normal from a practical standpoint, but emotionally, everything had changed for him. Prince George appeared for his morning walk right on schedule. When he saw James looking healthier and more stable, a bright smile spread across his face. He walked over to the guard with obvious happiness. Mr. James, you look much better today. Did the tea help your throat? James felt his professional composure waver slightly as he looked down at this caring child who had made such a difference in his life. Yes, Your Highness, it helped tremendously. I cannot thank you enough for your kindness. George beamed with satisfaction. I'm so glad. My grandma always says that when people take care of each other, everyone feels better. The wisdom in this simple statement struck James profoundly. Prince George wasn't just talking about the tea and soup. He was talking about human connection and mutual care. The 8-year-old had instinctively understood something that many adults struggled with. Your Highness, James said carefully, what you did yesterday meant more to me than you might realize. It reminded me why I'm proud to serve your family. George tilted his head thoughtfully. You shouldn't just serve us because you have to, Mr. James. You should know that we care about you too. That's what makes it special. This profound insight from a child left James momentarily speechless. In those few words, George had redefined the entire relationship between the royal family and their staff. It wasn't just about duty and service flowing one way. It was about mutual respect and care flowing both ways. As George continued his walk, James felt a transformation taking place within himself. The young prince had given him much more than relief from illness symptoms. He had given him a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of what true service meant. For the first time in years, James felt genuinely connected to his work and to the family he protected. Prince George's small act of kindness had reminded him that behind all the protocol and tradition were real people who cared about each other as human beings. Over the following weeks, something beautiful began to develop between Prince George and James. The young prince would often pause during his daily walks to check on the guard, asking how he was feeling and sometimes sharing small observations about the weather or the birds in the garden. These brief conversations became the highlight of James's day. What impressed James most was that George never made a big show of their interactions. The prince understood instinctively that drawing too much attention to their friendship might make James uncomfortable or create difficulties with protocol. Instead, their exchanges were natural and genuine, based on mutual respect rather than royal duty. James found himself looking forward to these moments more than he had anticipated. Prince George's curiosity about his work led to conversations about the history of the royal guard, the different ceremonial duties, and the pride that came with protecting the royal family. Through the child's questions, James rediscovered his own passion for his work. Mr. James, do you ever get scared when you're protecting us? George asked one morning. his 8-year-old mind trying to understand the courage required for such responsibility. James considered the question carefully. Sometimes there are situations that require alertness and preparation, Your Highness, but knowing that I'm helping keep your family safe makes any fear worth it. George nodded seriously. That's very brave. I want to be brave like that when I grow up. These conversations began to attract the attention of other staff members around the castle. They noticed how James seemed more energetic and positive in recent weeks, and how Prince George had developed a genuine interest in the people who worked to support his family. Mrs. Chen, the cook who had helped George prepare the tea and soup, mentioned to other staff members how impressed she had been with the young prince's thoughtfulness. Word began to spread quietly through the castle about George's act of kindness and its positive impact on James. Captain Morrison also noticed the change in James. The guard's posture seemed more confident, his attention more focused, and his overall demeanor more positive. When Morrison inquired about this improvement, James credited his renewed enthusiasm to feeling more connected to the family he served. It's remarkable what a simple act of recognition can do, Morrison told his wife that evening. That young prince has reminded one of my best guards why he chose this profession in the first place. Prince George, meanwhile, was learning valuable lessons about leadership through his friendship with James. He began to understand that true authority came not from giving orders or expecting service, but from caring about the people around him and recognizing their contributions. During family dinners, George would sometimes share stories about his conversations with James, telling his parents about the guard's experiences and insights. These stories revealed to Prince William and Kate that their son was developing a deep understanding of the people who supported their family. James told me that he's been working here since before I was born, George said one evening. He's protected our family for 15 years. That's longer than I've been alive. This perspective amazed George and helped him appreciate the long-term dedication of the castle staff. He began to see the guards, cooks, and other workers not as background figures, but as important people with their own stories and experiences. James, for his part, found that his relationship with Prince George was changing how he viewed his entire career. The genuine appreciation and interest from the young prince made him feel valued in a way that formal recognition had never achieved. One afternoon, James noticed Prince George seemed quieter than usual during their brief conversation. When he gently asked if everything was all right, George confided that he sometimes felt overwhelmed by all the expectations placed on him as a future king. Everyone always tells me what I need to do and how I need to behave, George said quietly. Sometimes I wish I could just be a regular kid. James felt honored that the prince would share such personal feelings with him. After a moment of thought, he offered some gentle wisdom. Your Highness, the best leaders I've ever known were those who cared about other people. You already do that naturally. The rest of the skills can be learned, but caring about others comes from the heart. This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. George realized that James wasn't just a guard to be protected. He was a wise friend who could offer guidance and support. James understood that Prince George wasn't just a royal child to be served. He was a young person navigating the complex world of duty and privilege. Their friendship had evolved into something that transcended their different positions in life. It had become a genuine connection between two people who had found meaning and comfort in their mutual respect and care for each other. The impact of Prince George's original act of kindness continued to ripple outward, affecting not just James but the entire atmosphere around them. Other staff members began to feel more appreciated, and the young prince's example inspired similar acts of consideration throughout the castle. 3 months after that rainy morning when Prince George had brought tea to a sick guard, James made a decision that surprised everyone at Windsor Castle. He requested a meeting with Captain Morrison to discuss his future with the Royal Guard Service. James sat across from his supervisor in the small office, his hands folded calmly in his lap. After 15 years of dedicated service, he had never imagined he would be having this conversation, but Prince George's friendship had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never considered before. Sir, I've been thinking about my future, and I believe it's time for me to explore other opportunities, James said quietly. Captain Morrison was shocked. James was one of his most reliable guards with an impeccable record and unwavering dedication. Mitchell, this is very unexpected. Has something happened? Are you dissatisfied with your duties? James shook his head with a gentle smile. Actually, sir, it's quite the opposite. My experience here, especially in recent months, has shown me how much I value service and helping others. I've decided to pursue training as a teacher. The captain leaned back in his chair, trying to process this unexpected news. A teacher? James, you've never mentioned any interest in education. It's something that developed recently, James explained. Through my conversations with Prince George, I've discovered that I enjoy sharing knowledge and helping young people understand the world around them. I want to work with children who might not have the same advantages that the royal family enjoys. James went on to explain that he had been quietly researching education programs and had been accepted into a teacher training course that would begin in the fall. His plan was to work with children from disadvantaged backgrounds, bringing the same dedication to their development that he had brought to protecting the royal family. Captain Morrison felt a mix of sadness at losing such an excellent guard and admiration for James's noble goals. This is certainly unexpected, but I can see that you've given it serious thought. When would you like to make this transition? I would like to complete my current commitments and help train my replacement properly. Perhaps we could arrange for my departure in 2 months. Meanwhile, Prince George had no idea about James's plans. He continued his daily walks and conversations with the guard, sharing stories about his lessons and asking questions about James's experiences. The prince had come to rely on these interactions as a source of comfort and wisdom. When James finally decided it was time to tell Prince George about his decision, he chose a quiet moment during one of their regular conversations. The prince was examining some autumn leaves that had fallen near the east entrance, and James felt his heart heavy with the knowledge that these precious interactions would soon end. "Your Highness, I have something important to tell you," James said gently. George looked up with his characteristic bright, attentive expression. "What is it, Mr. James?" "I've decided to leave the Royal Guard to become a teacher. I want to work with children who need extra help and support." The words hit Prince George like a physical blow. His face fell, and for a moment he looked much younger than his 8 years. "You're leaving? But why? Did I do something wrong?" James's heart broke seeing the child's distress. He knelt down to George's eye level, something he had never done before in all their conversations. "Oh, Your Highness, you did nothing wrong. In fact, you did everything right. Your kindness to me that day when I was sick, and our friendship since then, has shown me how much I enjoy helping and teaching young people. You inspired me to want to share that gift with other children." George's eyes filled with tears, but he was trying to be brave. "Will I ever see you again?" "I hope so," James said honestly. "But even if we don't meet often, I will never forget your kindness or the lessons you taught me about caring for others." Prince George wiped his eyes and looked at James with a maturity that continued to amaze the guard. "If this will make you happy and help other kids, then I think it's good. But I'll miss our talks. I'll miss them too, Your Highness, more than you know." The news of James's resignation spread quickly through the castle staff. Many were surprised by his decision, but those who had witnessed his transformation over the past months understood the connection to his friendship with Prince George. When Prince William and Kate learned about James's plans, they requested a private meeting with him. They wanted to express their gratitude for his years of service and their admiration for his new direction. "James, we understand that George played a role in inspiring your new career path," Prince William said. "We're proud of our son for having such a positive impact, and we're grateful for the kindness you've shown him. Your Highness, Prince George has taught me more about leadership and compassion than I learned in 15 years of formal service. He has a remarkable heart." On James's last day as a royal guard, Prince George presented him with a handwritten letter and a small photograph of the two of them together that had been taken during one of their conversations. The letter expressed the prince's gratitude for their friendship and his hopes for James's success as a teacher. As James walked away from Windsor Castle for the final time as a guard, he carried with him not just memories of 15 years of service, but the life-changing impact of a simple act of kindness from an 8-year-old prince. George's quiet yet powerful gesture had indeed changed everything, inspiring a dedicated guard to discover a new purpose and reminding everyone around them that true nobility comes from caring for others. The friendship between Prince George and James Mitchell had proven that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can create the most profound transformations, and that real leadership begins with seeing and responding to the needs of others with a generous heart.